Assalamu alaikum. I'm going to be covering some of the Usra lectures for part of the Islamic education component to your Usra meetings. And we're going to be covering the topic of the Madinah Constitution and its implications to modern government. Now, the reason why we've chosen this topic is, number one, the Madinah Constitution is something that has never been discussed thoroughly amongst Muslim circles in America. To my knowledge, I have never seen a book or an article written about this important historic document. The Madinah Constitution is the draft of the governing principles, really, that was established in Medina after the Hijrah, when the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, became the head of state of the first and the model Islamic state. It is ironic that something of that historic value is not written about or even known to many people. I did not know about it when I was growing up as a child, and I know that many children are unaware of this important document. It is found basically in this book, The Life of Muhammad by Heikel, that can be found in many Muslim bookstores, including the Islamic Center of Southern California bookstore. And the total text is found intact in this book, and we have sent out a copy of the Madinah Constitution to many of you, so hopefully you have read that document at this time. Also, we have sent you a chapter of this important book by Muhammad Asad called The State and Government in Islam, The Principles of State and Government in Islam by Muhammad Asad. Hopefully you have taken a look at that as well. It's ironic, again, that we've seen so many articles about beards, about dress, about cutting fingernails, about minutiae. Yet when it comes to the social and political affairs of Muslims and their status, with respect to Islamic principles and with respect to contemporary affairs, we have not seen much, if any, on this subject. Why is the Madinah Constitution so important? Number one, the Madinah Constitution basically underscored the radical change from tribalism to pluralism. In other words, what the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and the companions had done at that time was take a culture that basically was rooted in a tribal setting and really institute principles that made it into a pluralistic society, that made it into a governing society, that really established security and stability to a society. Number two, it laid the foundation for an Islamic civilization that would lead the world for centuries. Islam is the only religion that has a civilization named after it. There is no other religion that has been able to penetrate the socio-political arena in any comparable manner. When we think of other religions, let's just take a look at some of the examples. For example, a Jewish state. A Jewish state now exists in the state of Israel. This is a state that has not succeeded in creating any real civilization. It is a state that has actually succeeded by the imposition of itself onto an indigenous population, namely the Palestinians. It has succeeded by force. Political Zionism, which has been the driving force for the creation of the modern state of Israel. And this is different from the diaspora of the Jewish people, or the Jewish people, which is another name for the word Israel, by the way. But political Zionism is a deviation from religious Zionism that is found in many of the religious texts of Judaism. So this is a deviation, really, from religion in order to establish a religious state. And even then, there is confusion over whether it is a religious state or whether it is a secular state, and it calls itself a democracy, but it is implementing an apartheid policy today against the non-Jewish people in the lands, again, namely Palestinian Christians, Muslims, and even some Palestinian Jews. There's also never been a Christian state, so to speak. The Vatican today can be the remnants of a Christian state, but the Vatican has left the state in order to maintain itself. It is basically a church that sits on a piece of land called the Vatican, and obviously it enjoys many of the riches, the tithes that it gains from its adherents, and it is one of the richest institutions of the world. But in order to become the Vatican that it is today, it is something that had to have left the state in order to preserve itself. In fact, America was the product of Christians fleeing religious persecution from Europe because the church and the state were combined at that time, but not in a successful manner. There was much civil strife, there was much persecution, there was much killing at that time. So the Islamic State, as modeled by the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is the embodiment of a religion-based institution meant for all humanity. That is very important for us to understand. It was not meant for just Muslims. Just like the Quran was not meant for just Muslims, they were both meant for all of humanity. Let us go to the issue now of Islam and democracy before we get into the principles of this Islamic State that was founded upon the Madinah Constitution. Because this is a very important issue as we get into the diatribe and the discussions that we find in many Muslim circles today. Democracy is basically defined as the rule of the people. Democracy means that it is a form of self-government that we have. In America, it is not a true democracy. America is more of a representative republic because we elect decision makers who make the decisions and who rule over the governed. But that in itself is a form of democracy. The question is Islam compatible with democracy? Islam simply means the submission to the will of Allah. And in Islamic history, what we find out after the death of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, there was a head of state that was actually elected by a group of people, and that was Abu Bakr. And when he had died, he had appointed Omar to be his successor, but even Omar was ratified by a group of people. And after Omar had died, there was a council that basically had appointed Omar to be the next head of state, the successor at that time. And then after that was Ali ibn Abu Talib, who became the head of state at that time, who was also elected by a group of people within the Prophet's mosque, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in his mosque in Medina. So here we have the process of people electing someone to become the head of state of a Muslim society. So that in itself is compatible with democratic rule. Also, what's important is the Quranic verse that is in Surah An-Nisa, verse 59, that says, "O you who have believed, pay heed unto God and pay heed unto the apostle, and from those among you who have been entrusted authority." This process is called, I wanted to underscore in the Quran, entrusted. When the Quran says, obey God and His apostle and those from among you who have been entrusted authority, the focus is on the word authority. There has been little focus on this entrustment. The entrustment is actually a process. And those who are entrusted authorities are those who are given our obedience, our allegiance. But here we have a democratic application in terms of self-government within the Quran itself. This is my opinion, and this is opinion that I gained actually from listening to Dr. Fatih Usman in his talks about Islam and democracy. But it is something that needs to be understood, that we're not just talking about blind obedience. For example, let's take the example of Omar ibn Khattab, who became the Khalifa at the time, and when he went to the mosque to announce that he has become the new head of state, he basically is talking to the people, telling them that he will try to abide by the Quran and the Sharia to the best of his ability. And a woman had stood up in the mosque and said, you better abide by it, otherwise you will have to deal with us. So here is an example of not only democracy, but it can also be considered an example of a person ready to impeach the head of state if he does not abide by the Quranic injunctions and the Sharia. There is a process, obviously, and this process is something that's important to explore. So the question is Islam compatible with democracy? You look at the verse, you look at the process of entrusted authorities, you look at some examples we've had in our history, and you would say, yes, it is compatible with our history. The problem comes when we look at democracy as purely a Western invention. So when we look at the history of Islam, the history of the successors to the Prophet and the heads of state after the Prophet's time, it was more or less considered to be a democratic process. And when we look at dictatorships, the question comes, is Islam compatible with dictatorships? Because the question of Islam and democracy should not be viewed within a vacuum. If Islam is not going to be compatible with democracy, then what it is going to be compatible with? If it's dictatorship, a dictatorship doesn't mean self-rule or the people rule. It means one-person rule. And a dictatorship means that you give your blind obedience to that one individual regardless, because it brings upon an authoritarian style of government. And this authoritarian style of government is probably closer to shirk than a democratic style of government. So we have to be concerned about not looking at any of these issues within a vacuum, but the realities that we have today. In the Madinah Constitution, which I will outline in the next lecture, I will talk about the various principles that are outlined in that Constitution. And those are the principles of citizenship, of justice, of pluralism, of security, and of defense of the nation. I hope that you will take the documents that we had provided for you, and if you haven't read them already, please do so that we can have an in-depth discussion about these very important principles in the Madinah Constitution and how that relates to modern forms of government today. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.